Today, we're diving into the Reformation. But let's get one thing straight. This wasn't just a single event. It was more like a massive, continent-spanning chain reaction. Think of it as a series of dominoes that once that first one was tipped, would end up shattering 1,000 years of Christian unity and totally reshaping the Western world. So, what do a thunderstorm, a printing press, and a challenge to the Pope all have in common? I know, it sounds like the start of a really weird joke, but these three things actually crashed together in the early 16th century, lighting a fire that would engulf all of Europe. Let's see how they all connect.
You know, to really get how one monk's protest could cause such an incredible explosion, we have to look at the world he was living in. Late medieval Europe was, well, it was anything but stable. It was a world just simmering with anxiety, totally ripe for a rupture. It was a world of dominoes, all lined up, just waiting for that first push.
And if you want a picture of that anxiety, this is it. This is the danse macabre, the dance of death. You see skeletons leading everyone, popes, kings, peasants, doesn't matter, to the grave. See, Europe was haunted by the memory of the Black Death, a plague that had wiped out maybe a third of the population. So this created this constant nagging fear of sudden death and a really intense anxiety about what comes next. Was it going to be damnation or salvation?
Now, you'd think people would look to the church for comfort, right? But what they often found instead was just chaos. At one point, during what's called the Western Schism, there were 2 and for a while even 3 rival popes, all claiming to be the real one. It took a whole council just to sort out that mess. And you can imagine, these kinds of power struggles and scandals did a real number on public trust in the very institution that was supposed to guide them to heaven.
So all these things created a tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. You had a population terrified of damnation. You had popes acting more like warlords. Clerical abuse was everywhere, and the church was selling these things called indulgences to raise cash. People were noticing, and they weren't happy. In fact, reformers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus had been calling for change for over a century. The stage was absolutely set for an explosion.
And into this tinderbox, 2 things would come together at the perfect moment to topple that first domino: a deeply troubled monk and a revolutionary piece of technology.
This is Martin Luther, and to understand the Reformation, you really have to understand his personal crises. As a young man, he gets caught in this violent thunderstorm, and he's terrified he's going to die and face God's judgment, so he cries out, vowing to become a monk if he survives. Well, he survived, but becoming a monk didn't calm him down. He was absolutely tormented by his own sinfulness, and that deep personal terror, it became the engine for his entire theological revolution.
The specific spark that lit the fuse was the issue of indulgences. Now, officially, an indulgence could reduce your time in purgatory for sins you'd already been forgiven for, but in reality, it was being sold like a product. The Pope had authorized this massive indulgence campaign to raise money for the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and it was basically marketed as a way to buy your way, or even your dead relative's way, out of punishment. Listen to this little jingle. They say it was used by an indulgence seller named Johann Tetzel. It captures just how crude the sales pitch was, and it's what horrified Luther. To him, this wasn't just some abuse of the system. It was a huge theological mistake. It made salvation something you could buy, which completely undermined the idea of God's grace and cheapened what it meant to be truly sorry for your sins. This was the practice he decided to go after.
But here's the thing. Criticizing the church wasn't new. Luther's ideas could have just faded away in some obscure academic debate. The game changer was technology. The printing press meant that ideas could be copied quickly, cheaply, and in massive quantities. It was basically the social media of its day, and it was about to make Luther's protest go viral.
So, we come to the famous moment, that story of Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door. It's a great story, but it's probably a legend. What we know for sure he did was mail them to his boss, the Archbishop. They were written in Latin, just a list of points for scholars to debate. But thanks to that printing press, this academic challenge was quickly translated into German, and boom, it spread all across the empire. The first domino had just been pushed. So what started as a call for a pretty nerdy debate among theologians? Well, it quickly spiraled into this full-blown, uncontrollable public firestorm. See, Luther's ideas didn't just question one practice, they struck at the very foundations of the Pope's authority and the entire structure of Western Christianity.
And the escalation was incredibly fast. I mean, look at this. In 1517, Luther is just a concerned professor. By 1518, he's defying a cardinal. By 1520, his followers are in the streets publicly burning the Pope's condemnation, and by 1521, he's excommunicated and standing before the most powerful ruler in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, refusing to back down. In just 4 years, he went from a critic to a heretic and an outlaw.
So what was the big idea? What was this all really about? Well, at the heart of it all was this fundamental disagreement. The established Catholic view was that you were saved through a combination of faith and doing good works, charity, sacraments, penance. But Luther, reading his Bible, came to a different conclusion. He believed salvation was a free gift from God that you could never earn. It was received through faith alone. And this one idea, justification by faith alone, it basically blew up the whole system of indulgences and pilgrimages that medieval religious life was built on.
Okay, so this wasn't just a war of words and ideas for long. As those dominoes kept falling, they crashed into politics, society, and the lives of ordinary people. The unified movement for reform quickly splintered, and the theological split gave way to actual violence and open warfare. To win over the public, both sides used powerful propaganda. This woodcut is a perfect example. On the left, you see Christ, humble, wearing a crown of thorns. On the right, you have the Pope wearing this lavish triple crown, being adored by his court. Now, for a population that mostly couldn't read, these simple, stark images were incredibly effective at getting the message across. The papacy had become the very opposite of Christ.
As soon as the break from Rome happened, the movement itself started to break apart. There wasn't just one Protestant view. You had the magisterial reformers, like Luther, who worked with princes and city councils to reform the church from the top down. But then you had the radical reformers, like the Anabaptists, who thought they didn't go nearly far enough. They wanted a church of adult believers completely separate from the state, which was a truly revolutionary idea for the time.
And for a lot of regular folks, this call for religious freedom started to sound a lot like a call for social freedom. In 1524, this massive uprising known as the German Peasants' War just erupted. Inspired by these new Reformation ideas, peasants drafted manifestos like these 12 articles, demanding an end to serfdom and other oppressions. And they used the Bible to justify their demands. They really believed Luther would be their champion.
They were dead wrong. In a shocking and pretty brutal turn, Luther viciously condemned the peasants. He was horrified by the chaos and violence, and he wrote this pamphlet called Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants, telling the German princes to crush the rebellion without mercy. And they did. The revolt was stamped out with extreme brutality. It was a clear sign that Luther's revolution was meant to be theological, not social.
So, after decades of debates, upheaval, and outright warfare, the dominoes finally came to rest. And what they left behind was Europe that was permanently divided. Its religious and political map had been redrawn forever. This gives you a snapshot of that new reality. Northern Germany and Scandinavia went largely Lutheran. Switzerland became the heartland of the Reformed or Calvinist tradition. The Holy Roman Empire became this patchwork quilt where the local ruler got to decide the religion of his subjects. And all the while, Catholic strongholds like Spain and Italy were energized by their own internal reform movement, the Counter-Reformation, and started pushing back hard against the Protestant tide. But this division, it came at a staggering price. The century of religious warfare that followed the Reformation was one of the deadliest periods in European history. The total death toll estimates range anywhere from 7 to as high as 17 million people. It's an almost unimaginable number, and it represents the devastating human cost of this whole upheaval.
And that leaves us with a final massive question. The Reformation absolutely shattered the idea of a single unified Western Christendom. But in doing so, did it accidentally lay the groundwork for our modern world? I mean, think about it. Its focus on individual conscience, its challenge to centralized authority, the way it tangled up religion with the power of new nation-states, the echoes of that thunderstorm 500 years ago, they're definitely still shaping our world today.